Today's daf we're going to be learning is Horayot daf Yubet. I want to remind, this is the daf for Shabbat. I want to remind everybody to, if you haven't yet registered for the Siyum Seder Nezikin, very big, exciting event. We hope to see you all there. All the registration details can be found on the website. Okay, we're going to start right now with the top of our daf. We were talking about the shemen hamishcha, the anointing oil that they used. Umi have a shemen hamishcha, but wait a minute. How could Yehoachaz, if you remember, how could he have been anointed king? He was the son of Yoshiyahu. And it was known, as I mentioned previously, and now we're going to see it inside, when they put away when they hid the Aron. Okay, we're going to see they basically took Yoshiyahu, we'll see why, took all of these things. We're going to see all which items he took, and he basically hid them in order to be, we'll see, we'll see in a minute. But we're starting kind of in the middle of the story. From the time Nignaz Aaron, that they hid the Aron, Nignaz Shemen HaMishcha, also the anointing oil, the Tzintzenet Haman, the jar of man that was left over from the desert, Maklo Shel Aharon Shkedeu Pracheh, Aaron's mateh, his staff, with the almonds of the blossoms that came up after the Korach situation, Ve'argaz Sheshalchu Plishti, Doron Yisrael, and this box that the Philistines returned to the Jewish people when they returned the Aron Kodesh in the time of Sefer Shmuel, when they returned the Aron Habrit, Shne'emar, ve'et klei hazahav asher shivotem lo Hashem, tasimu ba'argaz mitzido, or maybe I should read it a little better. Et klei hazahav asher shivotem lo Hashem tasimu ba'argaz mitzido v'shilachtem oto v'halach. So basically, what the Plishtim said is, we're going to return these golden vessels to the Jews as a guilt offering. We're going to put this in with the argaz, in an argaz, in a box next to the Aron. So basically, they return the Aron with this argaz, and there's an assumption that the argaz was put next to the Aron, and therefore, when the Aron was hidden, so was this box that was returned when the Plishtim returned the Aron. Okay. So the question is, wasn't it hidden? Now, Migana, so when was it hidden? And this is the important part. Yoshiyahu Melech Yehuda Ganazo. Yoshiyahu did it. Why did he do it? Shava'ash Ketub Torah. He saw it was written in the Torah. Because if you remember, he has this big reformation, and he opens the Torah and he reads it, and then he sees all these things written in the Torah, and he sees it says, God is going to take you and your king. Figures, maybe this is him. And therefore, Tzivahu Gnazum, he saw that what was going to happen, that we were going to be sent to another land, right? This is in the end of Sefer Dvarim. It said this, and he says, I better put everything away and hide it so that they don't take it. So he puts away those things. He says to the Levites who understand things and who are sanctified, so he says to the Levites who usually would carry the Aron, he said to them, take the Aron that's in the house of the temple that Shlomo built, and you're not going to carry this any longer. You should serve the Lord and his people, but basically put away the Aron. That explains the Aron. What about everything else? And then we have a Gzera Shava. It says Sham by the Aron. It says Sham by the man. So we say, just like the Aron, also the man. Then, because it says by the man, it will be Mishmeret. It also, that's why it ended up being saved. Mishmeret is to save it for future. It also says Mishmeret by the Shemen HaMishcha, and that's how we learn the Shemen HaMishcha. And it says for the Shemen HaMishcha, Lidorot, and it also says Lidorot by the, sorry, I actually said the wrong thing. It says Mishmeret by Aharon's staff. And therefore we learn from the man to the Mishmeret, to the staff. From there, it says Dorot for the staff, and it also says Dorot for the, right, that the Shemen HaMishcha, the anointing oil, will be there for generations. And therefore, we get to the conclusion that all these things were hidden. So they were all hidden by Yoshiyahu. That's how we learned from the Gzera Shava, all the things that were hidden. From Yoshiyahu, we see he hid the Aron. Once he hid the Aron, we assume he hid everything else. And therefore, how could Yehoachaz been anointed with the Shemen HaMishcha? Not possible. It was hidden by then. To which Amar Rav Papa, and we quoted this yesterday, if you remember, we said, right, that Rav Papa said, just like Rav Papa said somewhere else, it was a farsa madachia. They used the balsam oil. Also here it was with the balsam oil. So it wasn't with the Shemen HaMishcha, but he was anointed. With that, we move on to the next topic. Tanu Rabbanan. Kitzad moshchim et hamelachim. Now we want to know, how would they do it physically? What did they do? What does it mean to anoint someone? So it's going to be that they put it on their head. But what does it mean on their head? Where exactly and how? Well, so the melachim, we have a different way of anointing kings and the high priest. Kimin nezer, they would put it around the head, okay, like a kind of a crown. They would anoint him in this crown formation. Et kohanim, kimin chi. The priests, like the Greek letter chi, which is X. Okay, now the commentaries didn't all know the Greek alphabet, and some of them thought it was like a chaf sofit and all that, but we're going to see right now, they're going to ask, my kimin chi, what is kimin chi? Amar Menashe Bargada kimin kaf yavani. It's a kaf of the Greeks. Now, what is a kaf of the Greeks? Some people thought it was like our kaf, which is strange. Why wouldn't they have just said our kaf, right? Like a kaf sofit, a long, upside down L. But the real answer seems to be it was an X. It's a chiastic structure, comes from the Greek chi, chi. Okay, so basically we end up with this X formation, which basically means, we're going to see right now, from the eyebrow over the head to the other side, and from the other eyebrow over the head to the other side. Okay. Now, I'm going to bring a braita. Tanechad, one braita says, "B'tchila motzkim shemen al rosho, v'achar kach nonim lo shemen ben risei enough." So they say first they poured oil on the head, on the top of the head. Then they would put the oil, first they would pour it, then they would anoint the oil, kind of like move it down between his eyelashes. Vitanya Charita, a different braita said, they would start with the eyebrows and then they would go backwards, which kind of, that's a little bit more like the X structure, although maybe both are in an X formation. But the question is, what would you do first? There's these two verbs we're using here. One is motzkim, which is to pour, and the other is to anoint. So the question is, what was the order? First, braita says first they would pour, then they would anoint, just kind of like move it with their hands down. The other one says, no, first they would put it with their hands and, go upward, and then they would pour it. So then they would pour more, presumably. So they say here, Tanaihi, it's a machloket Tanaim. And Ikad Amre, what's the machloket really? Mashicha adifa, the Ikad Amre yitzika adifa. One says the anointing came first, because that's primary. The other says the pouring came first, because that's primary. Now, what's this all based on? My time of demand amar yitzika adifa. Why would you say pouring is more important and would take precedence? Look at that sentence. It has two verbs, and this is when they anointed Aaron during the Yemei HaMiluim. It says they would pour from the shemen hamishcha on the head of Aaron, and then it says, and they anointed him to sanctify him. So it sounds like they poured, and then they anointed. And the one who says first we do the anointing, my timer, what's his reason? Because the real key thing is the anointing. Because look at what it says by the klei sharet. When they did the anointing of all the vessels in the consecration of the tabernacle, it says just mashicha. There is no yitzika. So they say then, but when it comes to the people, it says, right, Aaron, it says first vayitzok, then vayishach. How could you say vayitzok is not important? So they say, hachikama, matam vayitzok, mishum devayimshach. What is the reason you poured the oil? Because you had already done the mishicha, and then you do the yitzika. And even though it appears first in the pasuk, doesn't mean it takes precedence. Those are the two different interpretations. You can think about it, right? It's interesting. Is it really different? Is it modeled after the klei sharet, or is there kind of a different track for human anointing rather than vessels being anointed? Tanu Rabbanit, another braita. Now we're going to see this drasha about Aharon and some sort of miraculous thing that happened, which I have to think about what this means, but I'll leave that open to interpretation. Kishemen hatov yored al hazakan zakan Aharon. This is a pasuk from Tehillim, which talks about this, like the oil that drips down or something that flows in the beard of Aharon. What kind of oil was flowing in the beard of Aharon? So they say, he had these two droplets of oil, of the anointing oil that remained always on his beard. Amar Papa Tana, and Rav Papa says, here's a braita. Keshum is sapeo, there's two translations here, either when he talked or when he would get a haircut or cut his beard, olot v'yashvot le'bikars kano. It kind of would go up and sit in the roots of his beard so that they wouldn't fall while he was either talking and moving or cutting, okay, shaving. And Moshe would worry about this. Maybe I misused consecrated property. Well, why? Because maybe I poured too much oil on Aharon. And that's where the pasuk comes in. It was a heavenly voice that came down and said, Kashemen hatov v'chule kital hermon. That's later on in the pasuk. It says, like the dew in the hermon. Matal hermon en meila, just like it's not consecrated and there's no meila there. There's no misuse of the dew from the hermon. Av shemen hamishcha shemskan aron en meila. Also the shemen hamishcha, there's no meila. Don't worry. It's not your fault. You poured the exact right amount. This was a miracle that it remained there always. Now, Moshe was relieved then. Okay, but Adayin haya Aharon doeg, but Aharon was still worried. Amal, Shema Moshe lo ma'alav alani ba'alti. Maybe it's not on Moshe's head, but maybe it's on my head, because I am misusing consecrated property. Since I'm using it all the time, right? It's on me. Yatztava k'tova amra, v'hinei, and this is the first pasuk. Okay, we were on Psukim Bet and Gimel. The first pasuk is a very famous pasuk. Hinei matov u'manaim shevet achim gam yachad. What is that? It's beautiful and wonderful to have brothers together, to sit together. You're in the same category as your brother. Just like your brother didn't do anything wrong, you also didn't. Tanu Habana. Another thing about Mushlimet HaMelachim, and from here we're going to get off on a big tangent about omens. And Mushlimet HaMelachim Ela Alamayan. It would specifically anoint the kings by spring, Kadesha Timashech Malchutam, because the spring is constantly moving, continuing, and showing, oh, your kingdom will continue, because obviously we're always worried that somebody will take over and you will lose your kingship. So they would do it by the spring to show, right, this is a good omen that your kingdom will continue. Shane'emar, Vayomer HaMelech lahem, Chui machem, okay, this is by Shlomo, Chui machem et avdei Adonichem, v'oratem oto el Gichon. They went specifically to the Gichon spring to anoint Shlomo. Amar Rabbi Ami. So now that we mentioned omens, we're going to talk about all sorts of interesting omens, and some of them are actually relevant, okay, or still, I would say, practiced today in certain possible ways. So we're going to see. Amar Rabbi Ami, Haiman Abaye leda imasik shate ilo. If you want to know are you going to live out the year or not, here you should do the following thing. Nitle shraga basara yomi debeim Rosh Hashana Yom Kippurim. Okay, which is interesting now is we're about to enter this time of year, and there's a few things we're going to talk about at the beginning of the year. Light a candle in the 10 days between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, bebeita de lo nashiv zika, in a house where there's no wind at all. Im mashich nehore, which there's different opinions, either if it continues to burn all the way down and doesn't blow out at all, or if it blows straight up and doesn't waver, neda de masik shate, that will be a sign that you will live out the year. Now, this whole sugya raises questions about omens and about believing things, right? That there's a bit of an issue here. I mean, we learned in Sanhedrin, you can't do nichus, which is, if something happens, then the Torah says it. I mean, forget about learning in Sanhedrin. The Torah talks about it explicitly, that it's asur l'nachesh, that you can't say, well, if this happens, then I know that this will happen, and then I can, act upon that. So first of all, it could be you're not actually acting upon this. This is just, you want some sort of sign. But in general, we don't really believe in signs, although some people do. We're going to actually talk about it a little bit more soon. Next one. If you want to know, this is a little tricky according to what I said a minute ago, you're not actually acting upon it, but here you are. You want to know, is this business deal going to be a good business deal? Right? And as you want to do a business deal, you want to know, will it be successful or not? You should raise a rooster, which, by the way, will take a while until you do this. So I don't know. But if it's the best system, right, by the time you figure this all out, it will be too late probably for the business deal. But isham and the shafer matzvach. If it grows fat and healthy, then you know you will succeed in your business. You want to go out on a trip. Right? In those days, it was very dangerous to travel. And you want to know, will I come home safely? Go into a dark house. If you see a shadow in a shadow, you will know that you will make it home safely. Some of the commentaries say what this is showing is there's a reference to there's an angel. If there's like a shadow of a shadow, it means there's some guardian angel there out protecting you. The lav milti, but now the Gemara says, and this is not a thing. You shouldn't rely on this. You shouldn't use this. And some people say this is actually referring to all the omens we talked about, which resolves my problem that I mentioned earlier. You shouldn't believe this. Fascinating answer. if you believe these omens, and let's say you don't see the shadow of the shadow, you're going to get, and then you want to still go on your trip, you're going to get very nervous and you're actually going to doom yourself. This is like when they say, when you're overly nervous about something, sometimes you can actually cause the bad things to happen because you're kind of bringing it upon yourself by your bad attitude. So it's actually dangerous to follow this. Amra Abaye, Hashida Amra Siman Ameltehi Laolam Yeheragil Lemechze Beresh Shata Kara Verubia Karate Vesilke Vetamri. Abaye says, now that we understand that these omens actually are significant, okay, maybe we shouldn't follow them, but they actually are significant. You should, now here you're going to get to something you might be familiar with. Laolam Yeheragil, you should make sure to see at the beginning of the year, meaning on Rosh Hashana, Kara Rubia, okay, you should have squash, Rubia is fenugreek, Karte is leeks, Silka is beets, and tamre or Swiss chard, and which is the leaves of the beets, and tamre and dates. Those are things that are now. Why are these simanim? Now you might recognize this from the simanim we use on Rosh Hashana. Now Rosh Hashana, if you do the simanim, people all do, and this is great. We're learning it a week before Rosh Hashana. People use these simanim and they say, they use a play on words of Yehi that my, Yikartu Sonenu, our enemies will be cut off, or Yirbu Zechuyotenu from the Rubia. But what's interesting here is that's not what it says here. And the commentaries mainly discuss that what's unique about these things, they grow quickly. And because they grow quickly, it's an omen for you're going to have a good year. Okay, so this, by the way, goes back to the beginning one. If you want to know if you're going to live out the year, this is really about having a good year, seeing a blessed year. So these are good omens. Now, the Meiri specifically says, there's actually a good footnote in the Kohen about this. The Meiri says that in order to avoid this looking or this being like nichush, they call divination, right? Like saying, if this happens, I know that the following thing will happen. So the rabbis instituted making a bracha here, like a yehi ratzon, and that resolves the issue. In other words, that's why it doesn't say you should say yehi ratzon in the Gemara. But later the rabbi said, listen, this seems more like if you want to have these things and see them, it's a good omen, but it looks like you're doing nichush, which we want to avoid. So they have you add the yehi ratzon, which is interesting. And there's another interesting thing I wanted to point out here based on the previous thing that we just saw. I'm just going to open it for myself. In the Shulchan Aruch, in Siman Taf Resh Samach Dalid, 664 in Orach Chaim, it talks about on Hoshana Rabbah, there was a minhag, okay, to, here one second, Katfur Rishonim, Sheyesh Simam B'tzel HaLevana, the shadow of the moon. Specifically on Leil Hoshana Rabbah, that there's a siman there of what will happen to you or your relatives. But some people say you shouldn't do this to actually, because if you don't, right, if you don't see this sign, you're basically gonna, exactly what the Gemara said, you're gonna have a bad attitude and actually bring it upon yourself. And he says most people don't really understand this properly. They don't maybe understand how to look for it. They won't see it. They'll say, oh no, I'm doomed. And we should avoid this. So it even appears in the Shulchan Aruch, which is interesting, actually in the Ramah, in his commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, not in the Shulchan Aruch itself. Anyway, it's just interesting. Okay, let's keep going. This is apropos good omens, but we're going to see only one of them really relates to the omens. But Rav Misharshia said to his son a number of things. When you want to go into study with your rabbi, first prepare. Go to Shiur prepared. Read through the Braitas first and then go in, or the Mishnayot. And when you go there, look at his mouth, which really means look at his face, right? You're going to concentrate better if you look. If you're sitting looking down while your teacher's talking, it's much harder to understand. They quote a pasuk from Yoshiyahu. And when you study, here's the one that has to do with an omen, Girsu al Nahara Damya. Go, al Nahara Damaya. Go learn next to a river of water. I don't know what else a river would be if not water, but a river of water. This is something we saw back at the beginning, why they would anoint the kings by the spring, because it's constantly flowing. Your Torah will continue, okay, and it will the translation here is your studies will flow unimpeded, right? Nothing will block you from learning. V'tivu, okay, so that was the one that had to do with an omen. Now we're moving on to other things that he's telling his son. This is like a lot of fathers impart advice to their sons. V'tivu al kilkale de my parent mothers also. V'tivu al kilkale de mata machasya. Better to sit on the garbage piles of mata machasya. V'lotivu apande de pumbedita. Better the garbage piles in mata machasya than the palaces in pumbedita. Basically saying, choose a simple life. And tav gildana sarya, better to have certain kind of fish, even if it goes bad. Better than eating the kutach, which according to the translation, it displaces rocks, or not sure exactly what to say about the kutach. The commentaries are split about this, but either it was the same idea as the previous, simple food and not fancy food, although kutach was not exactly so fancy, but maybe he's just saying this food is better for your body and for health reasons than the kutach, which is no. Could be nothing to do with the previous sentence. Okay. Another thing about omens, and this is going to bring us full circle back to the anointing of kings. Ramah karni be'Elohai. This is in the Tefillah of Hana, in the beginning of Sefer Shmuel. Ramah karni ve'lo ramah pachi. Okay. What this means is the horn is exalted, is blessed in God's eyes, and not the jug. Davidu Shlomo, this is a reference to something that would happen in the future. Davidu Shlomo shenimshechu bekeren, nimshecha machutan. David and Shlomo were anointed with a horn, meaning the oil was in a horn, and they poured it out, and their reign continued for many years. Shaul v'Yehu shenimshechu b'pach lo nimshecha machutan. But Shaul and Yehu, their reign did not last, and that's because they were in a pach, which is the jug. Okay, notice the connection of the word to the previous. Rameh kifi, and this is Ramah Repach. Okay, so there's also the same language. Okay, pach and kife are the same letters but flipped. Anyway, that's just an aside. Hamashuach b'shemen hamishcha. Okay, now we're going to darshan this. We're going to go back to the Mishnah. Hamashuach b'shemen hamishcha. Okay, so who is that? That's the kohen. So now they're going to say, and it's the kohen who was anointed and not the kohen who was merubeh begadim. That's what the Mishnah had said, not if you weren't an anointed king. Okay, but you were a king who became, I'm sorry, not if you were an anointed kohen gadol, if you were a kohen gadol who put on the 8 garments, and that was what made you the kohen gadol, that was your consecration, you do not bring this par. Tanu Rabbanit. Now they're going to darshan the word Mashiach. In the pasuk it says, right, Haya kohen HaMashiach, Mashiach. So they say Yahomelech. Maybe Mashiach means king. Okay, the Gemara is going to ask, why on earth would you have thought that means king if we already know Nasi is king? But we'll get back to that. Talmud Lamar kohen. That's why it says kohen Mashiach. E kohen. Well, if you say just kohen, you would have thought Yachol Murbe Begadim, even a kohen gadol who wears the clothes and becomes the kohen gadol by wearing the clothes. Talmud Lamar Mashiach. That's why it said Mashiach. So it said kohen, so you know it was the kohen gadol and not the king. It said Mashiach, so you know only one who's anointed. Well, if it's all about anointing, maybe it's the one who was also Mashiach for the war. There was the king who was the Kohen Gadol was anointed in order to make the announcements before they go out to war. That was a different, but he was kind of under the Kohen Gadol. Talmud Lomar v'hakohen hamashiach. Now, why did it say it with the Hea Yediah, the Kohen, the anointed one? To tell you, She'em Mashiach HaGabav. It has to be the top of top. It's only the one who was anointed, and anointed particularly to be the Kohen Gadol and not to be the Kohen who announces before war all the announcements. My mashma, how do you get the means the best, the only, right? The one and only. This is in the pasuk about the Gid HaNasheh. There's this debate, right? There's a question, which side is the Gid HaNasheh? On which side is it the one that's problematic? They say it's on the one that's the special, right? The stronger of the thighs, which is the right side. So hachanami hamashiach hamiyuman shebemeshuchim, right? It's the highest of the ones. Now we're going to go back to the beginning of the Braita. So now they say, okay, so first we did the Braita, then we asked this question: how do you get there from ha to the fact that it means the best? Now we go back and ask the question I mentioned before, which is Amar Mashiach Yachol Melech. How could you have thought that Mashiach means Melech? Melech parhu demaite. Seir demaite. The king doesn't bring the par, he brings the seir. So obviously we know there's a whole section on the Nasi, who's the king. So you wouldn't have thought the Kohen Mashiach is the, right, that you would need to add the word Kohen. You could have just said Mashiach, it would have been obvious it was the Kohen. So they say, what might you have thought? That maybe, now we learned that the king brings, if he just eats chalev by accident, whereas the Kohen Gadol doesn't. So you might have thought what the psukim are telling you, if a nasiach and he just accidentally eats chelev, then he brings the seir, the goat offering. But if he has this helem davar, they taught the wrong thing, and then he goes with the wrong thing, maybe then he brings a bull offering that the king brings, but maybe that pasuk about the king, that the kohen gadol brings, but maybe the pasuk about the kohen gadol is actually talking about a king who does this helem davar, where there was a mistaken ruling, the king went according to that mistaken ruling, maybe they have a different unique korban. Kamash malan, no. It's the high priest. It's not, right? It's the kohen gadol and not the king. Now we're going to this aim ban. This Mishnah set up this comparison. We're going to have a bit of an issue with who the Mishnah accords with. So aim ban mishuach b'shemen hamishcha. Okay, there's two things in the Mishnah. We're going to go one by one. So first, the Mishnah talks about this aim ban mishuach b'shemen hamishcha, and the kohen, who's the merubeh b'gadim, but the par. That's the one difference between them. If you're a kohen gadol who was merubeh b'gadim, put on the clothes, and that's how you became the high priest. There's no other difference. Everything else you do like kohen gadol, just this one thing. So matnitin deloka Rabbi Meir. This doesn't match Rabbi Meir's opinion. To Rabbi Meir, Hatanya by Rabbi Meir, it says merubeh b'gadim maybe para kol mitzvot. To Rabbi Meir, but lo hodu lo chachamim. He thinks merubeh b'gadim also brings the power, and the rabbis just didn't agree with him. My time of Rabbi Meir. Where does he get this from? Tanya. It says in the following: Braita Mashiach. Only Ela Mashiach b'shemen hamishcha. Merubeh b'gadim minayin. Now he's going to do the same drasha in the pasuk HaKohen Mashiach, but in a different way. He's going to say, if it just said Mashiach, he would say that means Mashiach b'shemen hamishcha, the one anointed. Merubeh b'gadim minayin. How do we know also merubeh b'gadim? Talmud Lomar HaKohen Mashiach, because it adds this HaKohen. Oh, that means also a Kohen is merubeh b'gadim. So now they say, okay, so the Mishnah must be not Rabbi Meir. But wait, b'mayu kimte Rabbanan. So you're saying it's like the rabbi's position? Ema seifa, but look at the end of the Mishnah. Mishnah clearly doesn't match Rabbi Meir, because look, it says, Ein ben kohen mishamesh lekohen shavar. Remember, they made two comparisons. One is what's the difference between the anointed one and the merubeh b'gadim. Then they said, what's the difference between the kohen gadol who was acting and the kohen gadol, right, presently, and the kohen gadol who was disqualified from being a kohen gadol. And then we said the only difference is to par Yom Kippur v'asiri ta'efa, the bull offering, not ours, the one brought on Yom Kippur, and the minchat chapitin, the two sacrifices, the kohen gadol, the acting one, has to bring daily or once a year. Those two are only that kohen gadol. Everything else, the kohen gadol who once was a kohen gadol was disqualified and now, came back to not being disqualified. Okay, but they're no longer the acting kohen gadol. They could do everything else. Now that, Atan the Rabbi Meir, and then we're going to have a problem because the first line of the Mishnah matches the rabbis. The second line matches Rabbi Meir, and that doesn't really make so much sense. Because either it's, right, we assume the Mishnah was authored by one person. So how do we know that's Rabbi Meir? Tanya, if there was a disqualification in the Kohen Gadol, exactly the case we're talking about, and he left, and they brought someone else in his place, and then you have to add the words. The original one is no longer disqualified, but they're not the acting Kohen Gadol anymore because someone else took their place. Harishon chozer lavodato, the original one, goes back to working, and Hasheni kol mitzvot kuna alav. Okay, so the first one goes back. Now the second one, now we're actually talking about a little different than what I said, but it's kind of the same. I actually said it wrong. I should fix this. When we talk about a Kohen Gadol who was disqualified, they bring someone, it's the temporary one that they bring in his place. That's the one that then becomes rejected. Okay, I didn't say it right. What we have is, it's the same concept of someone who was removed from their job, but it should be more like this. Kohen Gadol number one, okay, A, we'll call him, is the Kohen Gadol. B comes in and replaces him when something happens. Let's say he becomes impure, so he can't act anymore. We bring in B. But then when A is no longer impure, A comes back. What happens to B? That's the real question. Kohen Gadol B is still in status of Kohen Gadol, just not acting Kohen Gadol. So we can do everything except the Par Yom Kippurim, and that's what they say here. Hasheni kol mitzvot kuna alav. Okay, so the Rishon goes back to his work. And the second one, all the mitzvot kuna are alav. Now, obviously not the Par of Yom Kippur, because that's the main Kohen does, and obviously not the Asirit Haifa, the Minchat Chavitin, because that's the one the Kohen Gadol brings. So they don't need to say that, but it's obvious that's what they mean. And that's Divrei Rabbi Meir, which matches perfectly with our Mishnah, and that's what creates the problem. How could this first part not match Rabbi Meir and the second part match Rabbi Meir? Now we're just going to go off because they're bringing us a second opinion here, which seems to be the rabbi's opinion, but the rabbis hold like Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi Omer Rishon Choser Lavodato. V'sheni Anova Oy Lo L'Kohen Gadol V'Lo L'Kohen Hadron. I think I forgot to mention we're now at the top of Amud Bet, so I'll mention that now. The second one, now Rabbi Yossi says, the first one goes back to his job. The second one, who was brought in temporarily, they're stuck between a rock and a hard place. They can't be the Kohen Gadol, and they can't even operate like a regular Kohen. Nothing. And that obviously is not what, right, our mission is holding like. And Amar Rabbi Yossi, we're going to see in a minute why he holds this way, but first he's going to tell us there was a case where this happened. Maaseh b'Yosef ben Elim, mitzipori, shirabu psul b'Kohen Gadol. Va'avaru minu acher tachtav. He was the Kohen Gadol. Something happened. They took him away. They brought someone in his place. Now, when he came back, the guy who replaced him, okay, the Kohen Gadol, the other Kohanim wouldn't allow him to do anything in the temple. Kohen Gadol mishumeva, because you can't have two bosses. So if they let him act like a Kohen Gadol, it's going to cause hatred between him and the actual acting Kohen Gadol. And Kohen Idiot, he can't be a regular Kohen, Mishum Alim B'Kodesh Ve'emo Redeem. We always go up in sanctity. You can't bring someone down in sanctity, so he can't act like a regular Kohen. And that's why he's stuck between a rock and a hard place. But that's the other opinion that obviously doesn't match our Mishnah. And the assumption is that one's disagreeing with Rabbi Meir. Again, we're stuck. Our Mishnah can't be partly Rabbi Meir, partly not Rabbi Meir, right? So which the Gemara asks, Reisha Rabbanit, the Sefer Rabbi Meir. How could the Reisha be the rabbis? The Sefer is Rabbi Meir. I'm Rav Chistis. We're going to have three answers to this. They're all kind of similar, which is, in the end, yes, it could be, but for the following reasons. So the first one's very simple. I'm Rav Chisda in Reisha Rabbanit, the Sefer Rabbi Meir. Sometimes it happens, Rabbi Mishnah, that one line matches one line matches the other. Rabbi Yosef Amar Rebbe V'Nasib La'aliba D'Tanai. It was Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, who put together the Mishnah. And when he organized the Mishnah, he decided on this topic, I'm going to put in Rabbi Meir's opinion. On that topic, I'm going to put in the rabbi's opinion. Right? The Reisha, the rabbis, the Sefer Rabbi Meir. Rava Amar, and this is similar, but sort of not exactly, with Rebbe, if you say it's Rebbe, it's Rabbi Yehuda Nasi who edited it and decided I'm putting in this opinion there, that opinion there. Rava Amar, Rabbi Shimon he, v'savar Rabbi Meir, b'chadu palagale b'chad. Rava says it's actually Rabbi Shimon's opinion, which we're going to see how we get to this. Okay, we haven't yet proved that, but we're going to prove in a minute. And Rabbi Shimon specifically holds like Rabbi Meir on that issue and disagrees with him on the other issue. So we're going to see this opinion of Rabbi Shimon, and we're going to prove that Rabbi Shimon holds like Rabbi Meir on one issue and not like Rabbi Meir on the other issue. And that's how we're going to say, oh, it must be he's the author of this Braita. Ditanya. Now we're going to bring a Braita. It doesn't say it's Rabbi Shimon, so we're going to have to first of all, see all the opinions that we saw in the Mishnah here about, again, the difference between the difference between the kohen who is anointed and the kohen who has merubeh b'gadim, that the merubeh b'gadim cannot bring the par of the mistaken, the helem davar. And we're going to see the difference between the kohen. We're going to see that the kohen gadol and a kohen gadol who stopped working, right? That the only difference between them is the par of Yom Kippur and the Asirit Haifa. Okay, so let's the Minchat Chavitim. Ditanya. Tvarim shebein Kohen Gadol leKohen Idiot Eluhem. Now it starts out with the differences between a Kohen Gadol and a regular Kohen. That's not our topic, but you'll see how we got to our topic. And then we're going to prove, by the way, again, we're going to have to prove that it's Rabbi Shimon also. Par habal kol mitzvot upar Yom Kippurim. So what's the difference between a Kohen Gadol and a regular Kohen? Number one, the par, this unique par we've been talking about throughout this section, about the one that comes if you make a mistake. Par Yom Kippurim, that bull offering only the Kohen Gadol brings. Asirit ha'ifad minchat chavitin. Lo porea v'lo poreim, he doesn't tear his clothes, or, poreas grow his hair long, or poreim tear his clothes in mourning. Afal hu poreim milamata v'yot milamala. All of us, I'm going to learn something else that we're going to have to explain later, which is he tears at the bottom in a kind of way you don't really notice, or something. We'll see exactly what this means, two interpretations. And a ray, so he does tear kriya, even though we said he doesn't. He tears in a particular manner, the Kohen Gadol, and the regular Kohen does it from the top, okay, like the regular way. We do kriya. Ve'em tamei lekrovim, he doesn't become tamei to his dead relatives, like the regular Kohen does to his close relatives. Umushar lebetula, he can only marry a virgin, which a regular Kohen can marry anyone, not necessarily only a virgin. Vasur ba'almanai, can't marry a widow, which a regular Kohen can. And the murderers leave the Ir Miklat upon his death. Umakriv onen ve'eno ochel ve'eno cholek. He has to continue sacrificing even when someone dies, a close relative. He stays when he's onen before the burial. He just can't eat the meat from there, or he doesn't get any portion of that sacrifice that he sacrifices. Okay, now we're finished with avelut. Now we're talking with mourning. We're now talking about regular things, other things that's unique to the kohen gadol. He can always say, I want to be the one to sacrifice any sacrifice he wants, and he can also take a portion of whatever he wants first. He uses the 8 garments as opposed to 4. Avodat Yom Kippurim ein kshera ela bo. Avodat Yom Kippurim is only for him. No one else can do it. And patur al tumat mikdash v'kodashah. This is the key line that's going to prove that it's Rabbi Shimon. This reminds us of the sugya. This goes back to the sugya we learned a few days ago. He's exempt for, he brings all the other korban olevi yored. He just doesn't bring the one on tumat mikdash v'kodashah. And that's going to be the proof that it's Rabbi Shimon. Gemara is going to say that, but I'm already telling you now. Now here comes the key that matches our Mishnah. Kulam noagim b'merubeh b'gadim. Everything is true from merubeh b'gadim other than chutz mipar mevial kol mitzvot. That's our Mishnah. V'kulan noagim b'mashiach sha'aval chutz mipar yom kippurim. And everything is for the Mashiach who left his job other than par yom kippurim b'asirid haifa. And that's the other part of our Mishnah. And there you have it perfectly. It fits our Mishnah. V'kulam ein noagim. Now they're just adding another thing. Einam noagim b'mashuach melchama. The one who gets anointed to speak before they go out to war is. None of this is relevant other than the following 5 things. Only these 5 things are relevant for that kohen, right? He's kind of like under the kohen gadol. Lo porea lo porem. He doesn't grow his hair long for mourning and doesn't tear his clothes. Eim tamei krovim. He doesn't become impure to relatives. Muzhar la betula. He can only marry a virgin. Asur b'almana. He can't marry a widow. Umachzir et harotzeach. And if he dies, the rotzeach gets out of the Ir Miklat. Also, that's divrei Rabbi Yehuda. I'm just going to point out, because we're going to say this whole thing is Rabbi Shimon, so how could you say this, Rabbi Yehuda? The commentaries say, the Be'er Sheva says on this, his commentary on this section says, on this Masechet, he says, Divrei Rabbi Yehuda is only on the issue of the Rotzeach, that according to Rabbi Yehuda, he's Machzir Rotzeach, okay, that all the accidental murderers go free when he dies. Chachamim only may know Machzir. So there's a machlok, a very side machlok between the Rabbi Yehuda and the rabbis about the Rotzeach. Okay, the Chachamim say, no, he's not counted as going gadol for that purpose. Okay, so now we saw the 2 opinions that match our Mishnah. So we're going to say, whoever wrote our Mishnah. How do we know it's Rabbi Shimon? Hi, mimad Rabbi Shimon. He, as I told you before, Amar Papa Man Shamat Amar Patur Al Tumat Mikdash v'Kodashav. Who's the one who says that opinion? That's Rabbi Shimon. Okay, now we're going to go and explain parts of this brayta. Chutz mi chamisha dvarim hamurim b'parasha. Right, the Mashuach Melchama is not relevant to all these things except for those 5. Where do we get that from? Minan Emile, Detana Rabbanan. They're now going to quote psukim from Parshat Emor, where it talks about the commandments to the Kohanim, chapter 21 of Vayikra, psukim 10 and 11 and 12. We're going to go through the psukim and go through the order and how this works. HaKohen gadol me'echav asher yutzak al rosho shemen hamishcha u'milei ado lubosh et habagadim. I'm specifically first reading the whole pasuk, and then we'll see how the Gemara darshans it. The Kohen, who's the gadol me'echav, that means the Kohen gadol, asher yutzak al rosho shemen hamishcha, that was anointed, and then wore, right? He wore all the clothes. So now they're going to say that's a reference to 3 kohanim, and that's why the next things that come in the pasuk are going to be relevant for all the 3 kohanim dolim. The one who, the one who was anointed, even the one who became consecrated through wearing the clothes, and the mashuach melchama. How do we get it? Well, there's hakohen gadol me'echav. That's already kohen gadol. Asher yutzaka rosho shemen hamishcha, that was poured the anointing oil, that mashuach melchama must be adding someone else. Who else was anointed? The one for the war. Umilei yado lebosh tabagadim, and he wore the clothes. Zemru be'bagadim, that's the one who was consecrated by wearing the clothes. Al kulam hu omil. So all those have the following thing. Rosho, the next pasuk. Rosho, or actually part of this continuation of that pasuk. Rosho le'ifrat, don't grow your hair long. B'gadav le'ifrom, will not tear his garments. Al kon v'shom et lo yavo, cannot become impure to the dead. That's 3. We need 5. Now, the next pasuk is onen. Now, onen, we know, is not relevant to all those, just the kohen gadol, who's the acting one. Yachol yuhu kulam akrivim onenim. Talmud lomar ki nezer shemen mishchat elohav alav. Now, when it talks about onen and that you stay in the mikdash, it says because the nezer shemen mishchat elohav alav, because you were anointed with the oil. They're going to say only the one who was anointed with the oil. Alav elo chavero, on you and not anyone else. Because it says Mishchat Elohim alav, on him, not on anyone else. So that is exclusionary. So that pasuk, just the kohen, hagadol, who was anointed. By the way, it's really coming to exclude actually not the kohen merubeh begadim, but the kohen who was mashuach milchama. But they're basically saying just that one, not the other one who was anointed. And now they say, now, once that next pasuk separated and said, we're not continuing anymore with everybody. Well, the problem is the next pasuk is about the marrying a virgin only. And that we know is relevant to the Mashuach Milchama. So how are we going to do that? Right. So after the pasuk already split, you might have thought you're not commanded anymore for a virgin. Tamalomar vihu. It says, and he. So once they say, and he, and he has to marry a virgin, that includes, and he, someone else who was mentioned before, and that includes the Mashuach Milchama. And that's how we get to that, the way those psukim are read, and then we get to the Betula and the Almanah, which are the other two on the list. Kitanai. Now they say this whole thing is a machloket tanaim, as it says, v'hu isha b'vtulah yikach, achar shechileka katuv riba, divrei Rabbi Yishmael. Now that's exactly what we just said. After the pasuk split and said only the kohen gadol for the onen, but then they brought it back to the Mashuach Milchama in the next pasuk. But Rabbi Akiva says, no, the V'hu is teaching something else entirely, and therefore can't teach this, and he has a different opinion, doesn't think the Mashuach Milchama is commanded to only marry a virgin. Rabbi Akiva he said that you would assume Kohen Gadol has to marry Betula, even if, let's say, he became Tamei temporarily, like he had a seminal emission, and that made him impure. But what if he has a a blemish, that disqualifies him from being a Kohen Gadol? How do you know that he still can't marry a virgin? Okay, because he's now disqualified. I'm sorry, he still can only marry a virgin. Talmud Lamar vihu, the vihu isha betula, even if he's blemished and disqualified, he still can only marry a virgin. So he doesn't think that the Mashuach Milchama can only marry a virgin. Now we had this question by the king. It wasn't Rava asked Rav Nachman, it was Ravina asked someone else. But anyway, Rava says to Rav Nachman, what if you have a Kohen Gadol who became a leper? Maybe that's different. Maybe he can marry a widow at this point, a non-virgin. Which was the same language used before, although here it obviously has to mean something a little different. You'll see because it doesn't really work. But there it had to do with the korban. Couldn't bring a korban when he became, there actually they use this in a different question. When he left being king and then came back to being king, and I'm sorry, he wasn't king, then he was, then he wasn't, and then can we connect those, or was he rejected from the korban? This means something else. There's different ways of reading it, but either was he mitchadache, meaning he can never marry a virgin, non-virgin, and therefore, right, like he can never marry a widow completely. It doesn't matter if he becomes a leper, or miftar patra, maybe it's just a temporary thing. Lo havabiyade, he didn't know how to answer the question. Sometimes Rav Papa asks that same question, but here we're going to have an answer. It says in the Braita, that's exactly what we just saw. What does it say? Even if you're blemished, you still can only marry a virgin, which answers the question because Mitzorah is blemished. The reaction of Rav Papa when he got this answer was he kissed Rav Huna and he kissed him on the head, and he said, I'm marrying you off to my daughter. Okay, he was so happy. I don't know how happy the daughter was about this, but probably most daughters of those days were very happy to marry the son, happy to marry a prominent scholar. Okay, new Mishnah. We're going to see a few Mishnayot here at the end of our daf. Kohen Gadol porim milamata v'hedyot milamala. This we saw before. The Kohen Gadol tears at the bottom, and the hedyot at the top. So what's the bottom, what's the top? We assume it means at the bottom of the garment where no one can see. But we're going to see two different opinions in a minute. Kohen Gadol makriv onem v'lo ochel, v'hedyot lo makriv v'lo ochel. Kohen Gadol, we saw this also, sacrifices when they're an onem, but they can't eat the food, the sacrificial meat. But a regular Kohen can't sacrifice at all when they're onem, and they obviously can't eat the food. So I'm a Rav. Lemata mamash. Lemala mamash. Rav explains with lemata, the bottom of the clothes where no one can really see, versus the top. Shmuel amar lemata makami safa. Lemala makami safa. Shmuel says lemata means underneath the neck of the cloth. Okay, like here's my seam. Okay, underneath the seam, not the way we usually tear kriya at the top where it splits in two completely. Just you can make like a tear in the middle of the cloth, but not that it's going to split in half. And lamala is lamala mekamis haba. It's above that where it's going to split in half completely. So it's like a less of a tear. But both are in the neck. Okay, it's both by the neckline. One is just below the seam, one is above the seam. Meitimi. Now we're going to have a difficulty on Shmuel. Al kol hamitim kulam ratzam mavdil kamei safashalo ratzayino mavdil kamei safashalo. Valavivimo mavdil. Okay, this Braita says there's a difference between mourning. This is a regular person, not a kohen. Difference between mourning for your parents and mourning for everyone else. When you mourn for your parents, you must do it split at the top. For mourning for anyone else, you could do it whether it's at the top or underneath, where you just make a tear, which means that it's actually called kriya. Now, if it's real kriya, and maybe you were thinking this in the Mishnah, how does the kohen gadol tear kriya at all? We're not allowed to. Well, we're going to say it's because it's not really kriya. But if it really is kriya, right? It says you can't tear your clothes. So if this counts as kriya for a regular person, how could the kohen gadol do it? So the answer, Shmuel Rabbi Yehuda Sfira Leida. Amar kol kera she'eno mavdil, safa shelo eno ela kera shel tiflut. He holds like Rabbi Yehuda, who says that's not really a tear, who disagrees with the Braita we just read. But now we're going to say, wait, but if he doesn't think it's a tear, but still you're doing some sort of kriya. Immediately, the Rabbi Yehuda kriya by kohen gadol, does Rabbi Yehuda really allow tearing of a kohen gadol? We're going to see he clearly doesn't allow any kind of tearing. So how can you say Shmuel holds like Rabbi Yehuda and allows some sort of tear? So Hatanya, doesn't it say in a Braita? So this is going to prove that Rabbi Yehuda really doesn't allow any sort of tearing. Ilu ne'amar rosh lo yifra ubeged lo yifrom. Now it says rosh lo yifra, his head and his clothing. Okay, his hair he can't grow long, his clothing he can't tear. But what if it just said rosh lo yifra, head he cannot uncover, and beged or grow long, beged he cannot tear. You might have thought, now who else has things about the hair and the clothes? There's priyat harosh, where they take off her hair, and the kohen even tears her clothes. Now the tearing of the clothes doesn't come up in the Torah, but it does come up in the Tosefta, where it says the kohen sort of grabs at her clothes, and if they rip, they rip. Okay, so you might have thought it means the kohen gadol can't do the ceremony of the sotah. He can't let her reveal her hair, and he can't tear her clothing. Talmud Lamar, that's why it says, so you don't confuse that at Rosh Hashana Yifra b'gadav le'yifrom. She'ena b'priya u'prima kol ikar, that you're not at all connected to priya u'prima. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. He cannot tear anything. That's why it's best stressing he cannot tear anything of his clothing. And that doesn't make any sense. We'll just continue in the Braita for a minute. Rabbi Shmuel Omer, Eino porim k'derech shebnei adam porim. Elohumi lamata v'hed yomi lamala. He just doesn't do it the way people do it, okay? He does it in a different way. So Shmuel sever like Rabbi Yehuda b'chadu, palagale b'chadu. We just say Shmuel holds in one way and not in the other way. Okay, and that he partially holds like Rabbi Yehuda, and that resolves it. Let's finish up our daf, a long daf. Kol tadir mechavero kodem et chavero. Whoever, everything that's more, this is tadir v'sheino tadir kodem. You have something you do every day, that always comes first before something that you don't do every day. V'cholam kudash mechavero kodem et chavero. And who takes precedence? The one who's more sanctified. Where do we learn it from? From korbanot. If you have to bring a par mashuach of the kohen gadol and the par of the whole nation, you bring the par mashuach first, because that's he's the more prominent one, the more sanctified one. Where do we get this from? The Gemara asks, where do we get this tadir v'sheino tadir kodem? The daily one comes first, because it says when they bring these extra korbanot, it says on the Chagim, milvad olata boker, asher olata tamid. These are in addition to the olah they do in the morning, which is the olata tamid. Now, michtik tiv olata boker, olata tamid lamali. If you say already olata boker, we know it's olata tamid. Why do you need to add that? What does tamid mean? Daily. It's to teach you, hachi kamar, kol detira, kol detadira kadma. Whatever is more frequent goes first. Last line for today. B'cholam kudash mechavero hu kodem et chavero minalam. Where do we get it from? The Tana de Rabbi Yishmael v'kidash, showing you should sanctify him. This is those psukim about the kohen in Parshat Amor. Lechol davar shebekdusha liftoach rishon levarech rishon litomanayach rishon. This is where we do. They get the first aliyah. They do the zimum first. That's liftoach rishon levarech rishon. And the levarech is that liftoach rishon is to be the first aliyah. Levarech rishon is the zimun, and litoman ayafar rishon, you even give them food first. Okay, and that's why the kohen goes first, because he's more sanctified. Okay, with that, we finished our daf, very long daf. Let's try to do a very quick review. Okay, we have the whole thing about the shemen hamishcha not being there, and then we had to say it must have been a farsimon that they used for Yehoachaz. Then we had, how do you do the mishicha for the kohanim? How do you do it for the kohanim, for the kings? How do you do it for For the Kohanim, from there we had the thing you do it by the Maayan. It was an omen. From that we got into omens. From that we got into the Mashuach b'Shemen hamishcha. Is that the king? Is that the kohen? Obviously, it was the king, but we had to go through that. And then we talked about the differences between the different Kohanim and who the Mishnah matched up to. We had a whole thing about that. And then we had the differences between the kohen Mashuach. How did we get that from the Mashuach Milchama and the kohen gadol Regil? How did we get the differences or the similarities? And we ended with the different types of tearing, how the kohen, the different opinions about how the kohen gadol tears and what they were based on. And we finished with this tadir and the more sanctified one. And with that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone Shabbat Shalom, Shavua Tov.